Hello. Immaterial inheritance, moral legacy is transmission. I was chosen by Mademoiselle Nadia Boulanger as her last disciple when she undertook to teach me 10 years, age 84. She asked my father if he would accept. 9.5 years later, this prophecy was almost accomplished. Well, it will never be accomplished, but for sure, I felt as if I am the messenger that, in a way, summarized all her experiences of teaching from her little Lily, 6 years younger sister, genius composer, whose exercises I was fed as an almost same age student of hers when I started working with her. So profoundly, austerely, deeply and intensely, harmony and contrapoint and fugue, analysis and reading, ear training and notation of compositional ideas, which, by the way, she didn't give me. They were in me. I just had the opportunity through Mademoiselle Dieudonné and her to learn how to notate them by always complexifying them ahead of time, so I could think more complex than I could notate. I could write music more difficult than I could play. But that horizon, exponential expansion that I was given at the thirst of my childhood, instead of waiting for a later time after academic deadlines and hierarchies of time, would perhaps bring it at a point where I would have déjà, as in French say already, accumulated a certain aesthetic attitude and opinions, regardless if they were correct or not, influenced by the time or by interpretations or influenced by great thinkers of music. I always wonder what she saw in me if I was her, as I saw in my students. And I think that that's why I started with immaterial heritage is the moral legacy of her musicianship, of her scholarship, of her core values that create towards a musical integrity of being, not just becoming best at this or wisest at that, not about niches, but about a certain overview of how things evolve in terms of interacting musical aspects of voices, thematic materials, formal organizations, destructuring of those, atonal, post-tonal, and in many aspects, she was not a guru who was defending one lineage. That was the fact that she was the disciple of Gabriel Fauré. She didn't have to mention it. She was carrying it in her own transmission. I was very lucky to receive it. I would have never known that language, which was not my musical birth language, meaning Fauré. Like many foreign students of hers, and mostly were, we arrived to her with some kind of seeking for a key to an answer or a way to build our own lock, to build and forge our key in order to get that answer. I think the wise ones understood that's probably the latter. because she kept always ping-ponging, like all philosophers, by a question to the answer of why, should I, when, where. And I think it came back down to the basic about music being sounds. And therefore, what is the equivalent in a first musical experience of phonemes and sounds that are not connected to symbols to transmit concepts like a language is the mother tongue. And the mother tongue is not a choice. We don't choose where we are born, why we are born, that less, but mostly what and at which point will connect us to where we belong from, other than being in the community of humans, divided in religions, divided in nations, divided in countries, divided in ethnicities, divided in ancient rancors, and all these in which sort of we arrive on our earth experience. We don't know how to make sense of it, but we belong through the language to our culture. The Russian, the German, the Chinese, the Portuguese, the Korean, we're all humans, but, and that is the most beautiful part of it all, is that the language of the mother tongue becomes the language of our daydreams, of our imaginations, of our constructions of incredible thoughts that could revolutionize universally humanity, but through our own language. When I was a child, since my mother was polyglot, and she insisted that I learn languages while I was under 7, which is supposed to be the age after which it becomes a translation with accents, like you hear my English, since I learned it latest in the languages I was told by ear, which was in my case Bulgarian, Greek, and French. Intellectually French for my mother's schooling, Greek for my mother's family, who was Greek, and Bulgarian because of my father being in Bulgaria. But then again, every language you learn after the mother tongue is a written one, like harmony, contrapoint, fugue. But you intuitively hear music, yes, but you cannot transmit complexities only by ear. You can transmit by oral tradition the folklore of countries, and God forbid, this is the richness of the cultures of the world, like their cooking, like their beliefs, how they think about death, how they organize their society through love, and how they organize their connection through love. After all, that's what we do when we give life, and then we care for this life, therefore we become protective. And I feel like music language is a given for most generations who lived briefly and didn't question the alphabet of the musical language they received until the 20th century with Schoenberg, for instance. That doesn't make it right or wrong. It just doesn't make them more, let's say, less adventurous. It's just because what they had to express fit the language which they received, which was the vehicle for what they had to express, which is different from each other. And I, as a child, imagined in a very childish way, very young, that each person had their own language. Just factually what the 21st century music is, with contemporary composers who invent their own alphabet in order to exist as different from the other, but nevertheless hermetically locked those who don't know their language. And translations over the music is like interpretation, is a comment over the music itself. After all, the composers from the past leaves us their music notated, not their interpretation. It's up to us to put it back to life, and in our own way, regardless if it's not coherent to the time period of theirs, because we're not supposed to perhaps even play it, therefore, because it was conceived for their time period by themselves. perhaps the universal aspect of their transmission of music touches us outside of the paradigm of the time. And so Mademoiselle Boulanger's teaching was based with me on a universal appreciation of music with individual connection to each stylistic language. And not only because of the book saying that this time period, like sliced cake, is the Renaissance, after which is the Baroque, before which is the classical, through the galant into the romantic, which opens the world to modern, and then after the eternal contemporary. Fine, but composers don't fit into the boxes of the musicologists. They sort of jump around. Some stay behind by cultivating the 19th century and the 20th. Some jumpstart a century that they don't even know, but they innovated before it even happened. And so the concept of consonance and dissonance changes completely in the 20th century, no more as a tension for a release, but as a coloristic effect, as a dramatic effect. It's a language change of paradigm. And I find that this idea to translate the native language into a universal language. If language is the transmission of concepts, then the sounds of the words that we produce, vowels and consonants, with our ear, throat, brain, are how we captivated music of the language before the meaning of it. And Mademoiselle Boulanger was constantly teaching me the most fluid understanding of how the sounds got to be organized. The 7 perfect fifths, the triton that at the end is the 2 poles of tension release that creates the lock and at the same time the tension that is necessary to produce a resolution, which in a way is the delayed action until the end of the piece. Is like a sentence that starts with yes, yes, but you know, yes, but you know when I think, yes, but you know, let me tell you what I think. And little by little you develop chromaticisms and different divisions from half tones to quarter tones, and you have different tunings, instruments, wind instruments like the organ, string instruments with bow like the violin, singing instruments that by essence we carry in us with lyrics, most of the time connected to church music for worshiping, and Bach contributed to this, not only because of his job, but it corresponded to his belief. He was, after all, a North German organist in the tradition, and if he was born perhaps in another country, another time period, he would have done something else with the same conviction if he had the ear to brain connection. And I think that the reason for which Mademoiselle Boulanger was such a universal attraction to so many diverse type of musicians, performers, composers, theoreticians, teachers themselves already. Everybody came to her during those 10 years I was with her, which were last ones in my first in music. I saw many people around me in their 20s, 30s, 40s, when I was obviously a child and into a teenager. And I realized that they're all seeking some kind of, if not answer, some kind of legitimation that they're on the right path of what they're supposed to do in their life, as if she would intuitively know, as she did for so many composer students of hers like Copland. And she did. Now you can call it intuition, experience, or the fact that she had an utmost level of honesty about music making that was not connected to any kind of characterial attitude of being tough for the sake of it, or mean for the sake of it, or in order to obtain iron discipline. It's probably because she didn't teach discipline. She embedded it in her expectations about how you needed to find a higher level of concentration in every detail of aspect you had to do. From a sequence into F major, 5 becoming 2 of B flat, and then 5 of B flat becoming 2 of A flat. And you think that the two parts in the right hand are in fact imitation of each other with a syncopation, and the circle of fifths inevitably in perfect fifths dropping. And then you restart B flat again, E flat. And she didn't mind if we stayed like in minimalist music, focused on a detail after a detail and following the flow of the tension release of the dissonances, in this case, needing to be resolved. Naturally, for a pianist, it's easy to do by ear. But if you state the keys in which you pass through, if you're aware of the voices, si, do, si, la, sol, do, si, la, si, la, you express it other than with your fingers. If you're a theorist not comfortable at the piano, you have to think fingering, suspensions through change of fingers on the same note. So suspensions for the legato and the stretching called for without pedal legato, meaning for substitutions. So if you were a composer, you found this boring because you want to get out of there, since by being a composer, the ideas, the imagination, in theory or in reality or in a imagination of the pure imagination of storytelling, doesn't bound you to this. It's just like a pianist who wants to play. But you have to practice. So in a way, the discipline is always a drawback. And in her teaching, the discipline was embedded in her expectation of herself and therefore of yourself. So it wasn't so much about faster, longer, better, concentration, performance, or memorization of chapters of books. It was about building your own understanding of the flow of events that developed to reach the tonal system of, let's say, the Bach 18th century. The modality, the tonality, but it didn't go directly into it. And so exploring with an open mind not only stylistic differences, but a flow of human creativity and coherence that brings you to a hierarchy of the tones in the tonality, like the dominant owns the leading tone, which owns in its seventh the tritone of the subdominant in the scale. So first the concepts of the tetrachord, the circle of fifths, the organization of the thoughts, and then how one leads to another. The suspension creates a tension and a release, but this dissonance becomes an expectation for a delayed realization, because by the time you arrive in a new harmony, you could have already moved off of it. And so it creates a sense of continuousness, of mode, of flow. And then chromaticism is a colorization, which is what it is etymologically in Greek. spicing the 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 language that you use musically. And so, in fact, she was exponentially expanding my horizons, not locking me in to Faurè's plagal cadences or Stravinsky's major sevenths becoming the new consonants, or Fauré or Franck descending thirds, or Ravel with the 6/4 on a dominant pedal. Because all these were very surface facts. She didn't try to hierarchize composers nor their toolboxes. It was about penetrating the musical thought of the composer through the piece in which they involved themselves. It was more about analyzing, cherishing, discovering, rediscovering the different aspects that a piece that we play or we can't play or we want to play or we didn't play or we would like to have somebody play like we hear it, because not everybody has the technique for the pieces or the orchestration or the instruments. Nobody plays all the instruments either. It was more about the music language, the music works, more than the composers by hierarchy of importance, because she didn't. There was no first-rate composer, second-rate composer, third-rate composers, universal, local, legends, or forgotten. And no, she didn't deal with that. Let less with interpretation. Original instruments, original phrasing or not might be a wrong thing. Perhaps it was not in her agenda's top importance, because intervals, gestures, expressions, universal, not a likeness, but universal connections between yearnings of composers' expression, either for their spiritual uplifting or their just human lively experience, dance, sing, celebrate, mourn. I think that was the most important that she translated to me, is to never stop learning way beyond her, which I continue to do, to never stop understanding that if I was given, as she used to call it, a gift of music, is to share it with the others constantly and without tiring, and no vacation and no weekends and no days off. And it becomes almost not only a calling, but it becomes a necessity, because you feel like that's how she wanted me to justify my being, not about let the richnesses come to me because I'm so smart. Even as a child, I composed things of adults. And no, it was always not belittling me, but keeping me to the ground enough to say, all what you can do or hear or produce is to transmit. And I think she willingly prepared me as the launching of after her, since I was the last one to take a lesson with her, because she was so humble to continue until her last strength to wish to teach me. And for this trust that she gave me, which is immaterial, which is not connected to any attitude, position, social, financial, any of this, no superiority of attitude either, of course. It was the true exercise of being the messenger of her immaterial heritage, her moral legacy to me, through me, being the chosen composer, student of hers and pianist, and not the one or the other, but both. And that made it perhaps for her identifying me to Lili or perhaps to others. But the fact is, in her long life, is that she respected me when I was but a promise, and she always insisted that I transmit that constantly. And that's what I do tirelessly. And in that sense, I feel like I am the legacy in person, in spirit rather. It's not rigid, it evolves with me. It evolves with the students I touch, with this degree of truth, expectation, and helping them find it inside themselves who they are, if they don't already know it or solidify it. It's so vulnerable and strong to be a human being who devotes life to transmit to others their own strength, to strengthen what they already intuitively feel. I don't make them, she didn't make me, but we make each other better.